I would like to begin with a book that I finished reading a couple of days ago. It's a very new book, a new book by my good friend Alain Badiou, La Vraie Vie, The True Life. The book opens with the provocative claim that from Socrates onwards, the main function of philosophy is to corrupt the youth, the young, to alienate or rather extraneate, in Brecht's sense of Verfremdung, the young from the predominant ideological and political order, to sow radical doubts and enable them to think autonomously. No wonder Socrates, the first philosopher, was also its first victim, as we all know, ordered by the democratic court of Athens to drink poison. Today, however, the task of a philosopher is no longer to undermine the hegemonic, hierarchic, symbolic edifice which grounds social stability, but to make not only the young, but people in general, perceive the dangers of the growing post-patriarchal nihilist order, which presents itself as the domain of new freedoms. We live in an extraordinary era where there is no tradition on which we can base our identity, no frame of meaningful life which would provide for us, enable us to live a life beyond hedonist reproduction. This new world disorder, this gradually emerging worldless, wealthless civilization, exemplarily affects the younger generation, which oscillates between the intensity of fully burning out, sexual enjoyment, drugs, alcohol, up to violence, and the endeavor to succeed, study, make a career, earn money, and so on and so on. The only alternative to it being a violent retreat into some artificially resuscitated tradition. Incidentally, the last time I visited Seoul, South Korea, I was fascinated. I think this really is the country of our future. Literally, I counted once on a train people, and 9 out of 10 minimum were on some medium, talking, looking at a screen, and they, of course, have in Korea the highest suicide number per capita in younger generation. The young people are absolutely obsessed with intensely enjoying and with succeeding a career. But you perspicuously noticed that we are getting today a kind of decadent reactionary version of the withering away, disintegration of the state announced by Marx. Today's state is more and more an administrative regulator of market egotism with no symbolic authority, lacking what Hegel perceived as the essence of state, the all-encompassing community for which we are ready to sacrifice ourselves. This disintegration of the ethical substance is clearly signaled by the abolishment of universal military conscription in many countries. The very notion of being ready to risk one's life for a common cause appears more and more pointless, if not directly ridiculous to most of us, so that armed forces, as the body in which all citizens equally participate, are gradually turning into a mercenary force. So I think, you see, this is the first thing that a critical thought should do, not just celebrate wonderful, no longer universal military conscription and so on. What's the price we are paying for it? That you have mercenary army. And that this, again, abolishment of universal military conscription is a clear case of privatization of state itself. This disintegration of a shared ethical substance, I follow here Badiou, who develops this, how this disintegration affects differently the two sexes. and I'm well into transgender debate. I don't want to go into it now. How?
今天那个观影会后面就是观众发表观后感吗？这是第2次观影会，大家明显没有第1次那么就是陌生了，然后感觉大家的表达欲都很强，然后纷纷要发言，然后一张口全是大便，就是大便魔怔话。要是光大便就算了，然后非得用精神分析来说。然后我大部分时间我就是听着，我就这样说好了。就偶尔有人问我问题，我回答1-2句。因为线下我不能讲太理论，而且没那么多时间，他说踢球就讲1-2句。然后这个电影很长，3个小时都看吐了。弹幕水平差不多，然后非要用精神分析讲，然后精神分析感觉他不知道，他最多也不是不知道，最多就听了名字讲过，大概是这个水平。然后他表达的观点其实就是那种直球批判的观点，是非常简单，非常精神分析说，他们说的跟精神分析没有任何1毛钱的关系。
No, they are not 2, they are 3, 4, 5. The latest number from Canada is that there are 29 sexes. But okay, I will not go into that, we can debate it. Men are gradually turning into perpetual adolescents with no clear passage of initiation that would enact their entry into maturity. You know, in more traditional societies, still, my God, half a century ago, there were many initiatic points in the life of a young man. In some countries, military service. You become a man after you do military service. Then it was acquiring a profession. Then it was finishing your education. This no longer functions. No wonder then that in order to supplant this lack, youth gangs proliferate, providing
然后现场的小朋友们该怎么说呢？反正我现场没有那么多时间评论他们，以及跟他们对话。但是我觉得，就是现场人大部分都是魏小将嘛，他们评论的出发点就是一直类似是凡是魏明子说的我们都要支持。然后呢，他们又是一种，因为明子很多话他也说过就不是相反的，我觉得他也说过比较全面，他们就只听一半，只听自己喜欢听的。比如说那个。那我估计直播间70%-80%人说这个事情大概也会一样做出一样的评论。他就非说那个苏联发动什么什么，那个就苏联入侵布达佩斯，不是入侵那个布拉格，以及就是布拉格之春那次事件了，说那个苏联不是侵略是正义的。我觉得挺可怕的。然后他们疯狂的那个批判这个电影，然后就说这个男主这也不行那也不行，就是什么这个电影里全是小布，怎么着都不行，然后就这么说。然后他们每次一通说完之后，我就会问，我就说那是你的话你怎么做？然后都不知道。然后或者他所说的跟他批判的刚刚好也是反过来的。反正就是人家怎么着都不行，因为他怎么做，他也说那他也不知道，但是那么做就是不行。然后我就想说，不愧是魏小将，我就想到那些批天批地，也要天天批我是小布的那些，然后我才感受到，对他们线下其实也是这样的。什么都是下头，什么都是资本主义，什么都是父权制，什么都是白左。什么都是否定性不够，什么都是没有人民性。 但是没有关系，都是从这个大变的时期过来的。对，真是给我一点魏小将的震撼，我真的没想到。就是布拉格之恋，不是说那个男主角苏联让他写那个撤回的声明，后来不肯嘛，然后就把边缘化丢了工作嘛，然后他们就说男主不应该不写，男主应该写撤回声明。然后他就说，他说那个，然后他就说苏联入侵布拉格是正义的。我就觉得蛮可怕的。就是那冰子别的东西都没学到，但是那冰子那个就天下就我一个聪明人儿，我非要杠，这个我觉得他们当时学会了。但我觉得我说这个你们直播间很多人也认同。苏联那就解放战争。
Ersatz, initiation, and social identity. But, and here I found Badiou's thesis interesting, he claims that in contrast to men who are condemned to some kind of prolonged eternal adolescence, women are more and more precociously mature, treated as small adults, expected to control their lives, to plan their careers, and so on. What then is happening today with sexual difference? Traditionally, we all know this, men were perceived as bearers of the one, the monotheist God, patriarchal power, stable social hierarchy, while women were associated with the two. Their position was always perceived as the one of between the two, between mother and whore, lover and saint, and so on. But you see in this between the two something much deeper than an effect of oppressive patriarchal ideology. A quote from Badiou, "A woman is the overcoming of the one in the guise of a passage of between the two." End of quote. The conclusion Badiou draws from this is surprising but consequent. It's crazy. I like this passage, although I maybe don't totally.
十个先评这本书，就是我当时视频里读的那本《何为真正生活》，但是我就读了第一段嘛，然后后面这个书的后半部分就是男生应如何生活，女生应如何生活。我好像直播都读过，但我出视频读过前面那段，现在他引的就是那本书里的内容。
Agree with it. Namely, Badiou claims that by their very existence, women are atheists. They embody resistance to one God, denouncing it as a fiction. Here is this wonderful quote by translation from French into English from Badiou's book. "A woman is always by herself a terrestrial proof that God doesn't exist, that God doesn't have to exist. It is sufficient to take a look at a woman, what is called really to take a look, to be immediately convinced that one can well do without God. This is why in traditional societies women are hidden. Things are here more serious than a vulgar sexual jealousy. Tradition knows that in order to keep God alive in whatever way, women have to be kept absolutely invisible." End of quote. Today, however, when the reign of the symbolic one is weakened, the hierarchy of roles and places under a divine name of the Father is becoming largely irrelevant. To fill in this void, a new one, the figure of one, subjectivity, is emerging. A hedonist consumer caught in market competition, enjoying life and simultaneously a ruthless manipulator in how he or she does it. Here, sexual difference re-enters unexpectedly. Men are more and more ludic adolescents, outlaws. Women appear as hard, mature, serious, legal and punitive subjects. This is why, as Badiou claims, there is a bourgeois feminism bent on domination. Women are today not called by the ruling ideology to be subordinated. They are called, solicited, expected to be judges, administrators, ministers, CEOs, teachers, even police women and soldiers. A paradigmatic scene occurring daily in our security institutions is that of a feminine teacher, judge, psychologist, taking care of an immature, asocial young male delinquent. A new figure of the one is thus arising, a cold competitive agent of power, seductive and manipulative, attesting to the paradox that in the condition of today's capitalism, women can do better than men. There is a political triad which renders perfectly this predicament, I think. Hillary, Duterte, Trump. Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are today's ultimate political couple. Trump is precisely, following Badiou's diagnosis, the eternal adolescent, a reckless hedonist prone to irrational, brutal outbursts that hurt his chances, while Hillary exemplifies the new feminine one, a self-controlled, ruthless manipulator who recklessly exploits her femininity and presents herself as caring for the marginal victims and so on. Her femininity makes her all the more efficient in manipulation. So one should not be seduced by her image as the victim of Bill Clinton, joyful, philandering about, allowing women to suck him and so on. Bill Clinton was the true clown, while she was the master in the relationship, allowing her servant small, irrelevant pleasures. Like, I imagine her, Bill, go there, Monica is waiting for you to suck you, leave me alone to do serious manipulations, planning. What then about Rodrigo Duterte, the Philippine president, openly soliciting extrajudicial murders of drug addicts and dealers, going up to comparing himself positively, of course, with Hitler? He stands for the decay of the rule of law, for the transformation of state power into an extra-legal mob rule administering its wild justice. As such, he does what it is not yet permitted to do openly in our civilized, so-called civilized Western countries. So if we condense the three into one, I think this would be the ideal image of the politician today, a person called Hillary, Duterte, middle name Trump, all three together. As for the, now comes next problematic, more philosophical point. As for the underlying form of subjectivity, which is operative in this shift, we are clearly dealing with a new version of so-called, what was for a long time called in psychoanalysis, in social psychoanalysis, the post-traditional Protean subject. Today, the hegemonic form of subjectivity is no longer the autonomous Protestant subject subordinated to the paternal Oedipal law which guarantees his or her moral freedom, but a fluid subject, a subject who experiences itself as permanently reinventing and reconstructing itself, joyfully experimenting with combinations of different identities. The paradigmatic theorist of this new form of subjectivity is Judith Butler, and although she insists on its subversive character, it is easy to demonstrate that such a subjectivity, you know, permanently reconstructing itself through performatively enacting, assuming different positions and so on, a subjectivity rejecting any fixed identity, obsessed with playful discursive reinvention, fits perfectly our consumerist commodified society. This is why the obsessive attacks on patriarchy and Oedipal order sound at least for me, false and desperate. They attack an enemy who is in full retreat, reacting to something new which is already hegemonic. In short, the problem with this vision of a new fluid subjectivity, it's not that it is utopian, but that it is already predominant. Yet another case of the hegemonic ideology presenting itself as subversive and transgressive. Now, this, of course, appears to be, but I think it's not the central conflict today. Forces of freedom, plurality, reinvention versus new forms of religious or whatever fundamentalism. I think this is ultimately a pseudo struggle, which is lost in advance. The first problem I see here is that one cannot distinguish in a direct way the universal dimension of the emancipatory project and the identity of a particular way of life, so that, as liberals are telling us, while we are all together engaged in a universal struggle for freedom, equality, and so on, tolerance, and so on, we should simultaneously fully respect the right of each group to each particular way of life. One should never forget that for a subject who lives a particular way of life, all universals appear to him colored by this specific way of life. Each identity, each way of life, comprises also a specific way to relate to other ways of life. So when we posit as a guideline that each group should be left to enact its particular identity, to practice its own way of life, the problem immediately arises. Where do customs that form my identity stop, and where does injustice begin? Are women's rights just our custom, or is the struggle for women's rights also universal and, in this sense, part of the emancipatory struggle? Is homophobia just a thing of particular culture to be tolerated as a component of its identity? Should arranged marriages, which form the very core of the kinship structures of some societies, should they also be accepted as part of a particular identity? Where to draw the line? The task is here, I think, to bring the struggle into every particular way of life. Each particular way of life is antagonistic, full of inner tensions and inconsistencies. And the only way to proceed is to work for an alliance of struggles in different cultures. From here, I would like to return to the project, which is, of course, the alpha and omega of today's left, of the alliance between progressive middle classes fighting for LGBT tolerance and so on, and the so-called nomadic proletarians, all these third world refugees. In terms of concrete problematic, this means that the politico-economic struggle against global capitalism and the struggle for sexual freedoms, tolerance, and so on have to be conceived as the two forms of aspects of the same struggle, which is, I claim, extremely difficult. All the desperate calls for the unification of struggles. I know there are some wonderful, almost dreamy scenes that I remember. For example, my friend showed me photos of how in a small Palestinian village close to Jerusalem, there were effectively 2-3 years ago demonstrations protesting Israeli activity where it was incredible. Muslim women, totally covered, walked together with transgender and feminists dressed in an extremely provocative way, and so on and so on. Okay, I almost cried, it's beautiful, but I claim it cannot be universalized. I don't share the hope of some of my leftist friends that you see, it's the beginning and slowly we will have the majority. I don't think this will happen, because I think that today's predominant form of anti-sexist struggle in developed Western countries is to such an extent constrained by our own ideological coordinates that it's simply impossible to unify it with third world economic struggles against Western domination. Maybe the phrase class struggle and anti-sexist struggle conceal a hidden hard choice, one or the other, never both of them. In spite of all the rhetoric of solidarity, today's actual nomadic proletarians, immigrants from non-Western countries, and today's actual anti-sexist movements cannot find the same language. To construct a shared space for both of them is a difficult task that requires long and hard work of self-transformation from both sides. From both sides. Not only will the immigrants have to change profoundly their identity, really radically, abandon their way of reproducing themselves through family ties, but also here, all this, you know, I call them the people who fight here for anti-sexist and so on, who causes but express abstract solidarity with immigrants. It's not enough. The way they are, you cannot unite them without radical self-transformation on both sides. Second general point I want to make it here. I think that one of the main, if not the main, ideological obstacle to this unity in the West is political correctness. Why? No, it's not. People usually accuse me that when I attack political correctness, I do it for egotist reasons to justify my propensity to make dirty, tasteless jokes and so on. It's not as simple as that. I want to begin by a quote from Edward Bond that perhaps you know it. If you can't face Hiroshima in the theater, you'll eventually end up in Hiroshima itself. This is, I think, the best argument against those who oppose graphic descriptions of sexual violence and other atrocities, dismissing them as participating in the same violence these descriptions pretend to critically analyze and reject. For example, in a very critical review of my own intervention at the Walter Benjamin conference in Ramallah, a little bit less than a year ago, the writer in some German journal, I forgot where, claims that I enumerate, quote now, criticism of me, a detailed list of ritualized sexual violences taking place outside of the Islamic world, thus showing my willingness to accompany honor killings with matching atrocities. He, me, was each time rhetorically apologetic about his descriptions. It's really hard for me to talk about this and so on. And each time he came back with more obscene, bloody and graphic details. This is sufficient to grasp the pointlessness and ambivalence of his intervention, displaying concerns about sexual violence by subjecting the watchful audience. I was accused of just reproducing the same horrors. This, I think, is the prototype of politically correct line of argumentation. In order, I claim, to really grasp sexual violence, one has to be shocked, traumatized even by it. If we constrain ourselves to aseptic technical descriptions, we do exactly the same as those who refer to torture as enhanced interrogation technique or to rape as enhanced seduction technique. It is only the taste of the real thing that effectively vaccinate us against it. And we can already see the consequences of such a stance of protection. When at the beginning of September of this year, 2 months ago, Facebook censored the iconic napalm girl photo of a terrified 9-year-old girl, Vietnamese girl, running away from napalm bombs. It hypocritically justified it as a defense against displaying child nudity, which can count as child pornography. Of course, ignoring the obvious political dimension. Along these lines, the one whom I appreciate very much, Nikki Johnson Houston, it's an American black lawyer, wrote a wonderful letter to the public where he describes eloquently how, quote, white liberals have hijacked the conversation about diversity, political correctness, and what topics we should be outraged about. Now comes the long quote. My problem with liberalism is that it's more concerned with policing people's language and thoughts without requiring them to do anything to fix the problem. White liberal college students speak of safe spaces, trigger words, microaggressions, and white privilege, while not having to do anything, or more importantly, give up anything. They can't even have a conversation with someone who sees the world differently without resorting to call him or her a racist, homophobic, misogynistic, bigot, and trying to have him or her banned from campus or ruin them and their reputation. They say they feel black people's pain because they took a trip to Africa to help the disadvantaged, but are unwilling to go to a black neighborhood in the city in which they live. These same college students will espouse the joys of diversity, but will in the same breath assume you are only on campus because of affirmative action, or that all black people grew up in poverty. End of quote. Therein resides, I think, the political problem with political correctness. To repeat Robespierre, it admits the injustices of the actual life, but it wants to cure them with what Robespierre called revolution without revolution, in exact parallel, incidentally, to today's consumerism, which offers coffee without caffeine, chocolate without sugar, beer without alcohol, multiculturalism without violent clashes, and so on and so on. We have everything today, these censored, aseptic, politically correct versions. For example, so-called Native Americans. We call them once Indians. I much prefer the term Indians, incidentally, as they do also my so-called Indian friends. You know what they told me? No, I'm not a Native American. Because if I'm native nature, what are you, white culture? I prefer to be called Indian, because in this way, at least my name is a monument to the stupidity of white men who thought they discovered India and so on. You have to really encounter all those protective victims to see how they hate this politically correct approach and so on and so on. And they are so sensitive about the dangers of patronizing them. For example, a friend in Missoula, Montana, it happened. An academic guy there gave me a small study he wrote proving that Native Americans, Indians, killed more buffaloes and burned more forests than all white people combined there. No, it's not crazy masochism. It's just a wonderful insight into, no, thanks for your patronizing image of us. You know, the first right of autonomy is I can also be as evil as you, maybe even worse. That's where true anti-racism begins. What liberals want is a vision of social change with no actual change, a change where no blood is spilled, where no one gets really hurt, where well-meaning liberals remain cocooned in their safe enclaves. A further consequence of this politically correct speech is the spreading prohibition of irony. When one makes a remark considered non-politically correct, it is less and less possible to save oneself by claiming it was meant ironically. Here I claim opposites coincide again. In the beginning of September of this year, 2 months ago, media reported that North Korea has forbidden people from making sarcastic comments about Kim Jong-un or his regime in their everyday conversation. Even indirect criticism has been banned. Namely, it's a wonderful news. The people in North Korea started to do what? To use in an ironic way the official phrases themselves. For example, as you know, North Korea blames everything on United States. All their misfortunes are because South Korea is still occupied by Americans and so on. So people started you like somebody doesn't function, a train crashes, there is no food, and people say, oh, this is all America's fault, and so on and so on. And in a wonderful scene which was reported in media, at one public meeting where by mistake one foreigner found himself, a desperate ordinary guy says, listen, we cannot criticize the official regime. Now we cannot even agree with it because then we can be accused of irony. So what can we do? And in a wonderful symptomatic moment of truth, the functionary from central government said, just shut up and everything will be okay. So now I move to more general points from all this. We are witnessing today something that one cannot but call the disintegration of what Hegel named Sittlichkeit. Not simply morality, but mores, customs, Sitten, the thick background of mostly unwritten rules of social life.
这个齐德克他好多书就是跟这个白左抬杠嘛。一开始嘛，我听听也就算了，一开始听听觉得说的还挺有道理的，但是说实话，现在时间长了，怎么说呢？就你会发现在那个现实的这个舆论场中不是那么回事儿。现实舆论场里面跟他做出类似同样指责的是右派，一些民族主义者、保守派、法西斯分子什么的，所以他们指责的理由跟齐德克当然不太一样。我们会说一些蠢话，当然我们听起来是蠢话，但是人家自己在人家自己逻辑里面也挺自洽的，也觉得挺有道理的，就说什么。比如说什么那个昨天我看新闻说，就 RT 发的，说那个俄罗斯杜马通过了议案禁止变性手术。他那个因为在那个宣布的时候说什么，美国现在有100多万变性人，然后 RT 就说俄罗斯通过了表决，好像是什么反正总之没有一票反对。不知道是不是全票通过，总之是没有一票反对。说那个禁止变性手术。齐德克也会喷这个事情啊，他也会说这个事情不行。怎么说呢？当然了，他是这个。但是我马上要变成跟齐德克一样的问题了，我也想说，应该禁止变性手术嘛，有点人说我恐跨，所以没有必要。就是你讲这种精致的理论，他们也听不懂，没有必要。有人说我反跨、恐跨，我自己身为跨性别，我还反跨以及恐跨，那我怎么说？就只能不碰这个问题。这个问题跟那个女性的问题一样，都不能说，说了就挨骂，可怕。就同意就完事儿，同意。你的观点是什么，我都同意。 对，你在国内复读齐的这个东西批判白左，你会发现你说的话跟波士顿圆脸以及他的粉丝说的话惊人的相似。
Life, which tell us what we can do and what we cannot do. This, I claim, is disintegrating on two accounts. On the one hand, it's, you may have noticed it, more and more possible, and here I'm a classic moralist, I'm for hypocrisy, I'm for keeping the appearances. Namely, I don't know how it is in Germany, but I know from the United States to my own city country, Slovenia, things that it was unimaginable like 10 years ago, not even 20 years ago, for them to say it publicly. Now they can be widely propagated publicly and nobody reacts. For example, I must report this to you, what I was shocked by it. It happened in Slovenia 2 months ago. In the main right-wing weekly magazine, one of their anti-immigrant European racist commentators published a ferocious attack on George Soros, claiming that, calling him Talmudo-Zionist, who is the most dangerous living person on earth. Why? The idea was that he, Soros, is fulfilling, actualizing the old Zionist plan of ruining Western European identity and culture by secretly organizing Muslim immigrants to enter Europe. And these immigrants are characterized in openly racist terms as Muslim Negroid hordes and so on, whatever. What I like here, I like these excessive moments of ideology because they are the moment of truth. Like, you think that we live in some kind of a conflict between Zionism and Islam. No, to this guy everything is clear. Behind this Muslim invasion of Europe, it's Zionism. Are the Jews. The Jews are again the hidden masters, so it's all one big plot and so on and so on. Okay, I will not go on and lose time here. What I just wanted to tell you is how surprised I am that nobody reacts to this. People laugh a little bit, oh, did you read that idiot, what he wrote there? But it's slowly becoming a common currency to talk like this. So again, I believe what is happening today is again things which were years ago something that belonged to this private domain of dirty rumors, paranoiac ideas and so on. We all maybe were telling each other all this, but it was private fantasies, as it were, are now becoming a public currency. I will not even enumerate an example of this. All I want to say is that for me, civilization in good and in bad means that you know not only written rules but the unwritten rules. Let me give you an example which is not a good one. I remember it from when I was serving Yugoslav army in 70s, but that's all. But it was a nice example of
快进来，小白。因为他们踢足球，我估计快回来了，把猫抓进来。
Two of us Slovenes were caught talking among ourselves Slovene. We were immediately accused of nationalism, separatism, and so on and so on. Then, at some political class, one of the soldiers asked the officer, "Comrade officer, whatever, isn't there a small contradiction here? We have to speak Serbo-Croat, but in Constitution it says all languages, official languages, the four that I enumerated, are equal." What happened is that the officer simply told him, "You are an idiot, you don't understand anything. If you ask a question like this again, you will be arrested." You see how this is how ideology works in everyday life. It's not only that things are prohibited. The prohibition itself is prohibited. And I will make a jump now, I improvise a lot today. Trump is precisely violating this prohibition. For example, he tried to prove, I was quite shocked, in one of his TV interviews that his wife, Melania, who is Slovene, I'm proud to tell you, but I'm ashamed, that what a great lady she is. And she said something that, I don't want to use the dirty word, flatulence, you know, if you eat too many beans or what. He said that never once in their marriage did he hear her emitting a sound of flatulence. You know what's the problem? The problem is that you don't say this, my God. You know, the vulgarity is not in doing this. The vulgarity is in even saying this. Or the same was with Hillary Clinton. Once Donald Trump made fun of her because she had to disappear for 3 minutes, probably taking a break for the toilet. And Trump said, "I don't want even to imagine where she went, it's disgusting," and so on. No, sorry, we all do this. The disgusting thing is to mention this publicly. And Trump can do it, which is why he is, for me, one of the symbols of this, let's call it, disintegration of ethical substance. I claim that manners matter, because now you can say, but we have serious problems today. The threat of a new world war, ecological catastrophe, and so on. Why talk about manners? Here I am tempted to repeat, you know, De Quincey's famous quip about the simple art of murder. How many people began with a simple murder and ended up behaving badly at a table and so on. I'm tempted to say how many people began with unleashing terror and economic catastrophes and ended up behaving badly at the party. Because I think manners do matter. Sometimes precisely manners are the last thing that separates us from direct barbarism. And here I'm becoming a leftist moralist. I'm claiming that some of us are unfortunately old enough to remember the 60s, where it was, I remember, popular to use the F word, to talk a little bit brutally, dirty, to denounce the hypocrisy of the official jargon. But now, the right-wingers, populists, are talking like that. And I think the left should shamelessly use the chance and present itself as a defender of decency and public manners. We should be this today. Let me go on.
他是在暗示某位卫星主播吗？
Another very tricky topic at this level is Europe, Eurocentrism, and so on. I think that another leftist tragedy today should be a qualified Eurocentrism. Why? Today, of course, I don't agree with right-wingers who claim our culture is threatened by Islam, by whoever. I fully admit that the greatest threat today to what is worth saving from European legacy are precisely our anti-immigrant populist defenders of Europe themselves. But we should nonetheless beware of something. If you look at a high-quality critique of dark aspects of European legacy, and there are many of them, don't forget that Holocaust, colonial horrors, even Gulag, these are ultimately results of European civilization. But if you look closely at it, we have to admit that the very position from which we criticize this, from which we are horrified at this, is a European one. Radical egalitarianism, feminism, and so on. The idea of us as abstract individuals, where ultimately it doesn't matter if we are men, women, and so on, is part of European legacy. All other cultures are basically organic. Organic in the sense that each of us at his, her, their proper place within the social edifice. And this is for me why criticism of Eurocentrism is so popular today. It's not something good. It's a very ominous sign of the fact that that capitalism is entering a new stage where it no longer needs universal emancipation, freedom, equality, and so on and so on. So this brings me to my next very problematic, for some of you, political point. It's nice to be against global capitalism, but I absolutely don't believe that the ultimate resort of this anti-global capitalist struggle can be some local manners, local communities resisting to it, and so on and so on. I always claim global capitalism is fully multiculturalist. It functions ideally with multitude of local cultures, and so on and so on. Let me give you an example. It happened recently, I found it in the media. In the fall of 2016, a 55-year-old former pastor in Santiago Quetzalapa, a remote indigenous community in the south of Mexico, raped an 8-year-old girl. And the local court condemned him to buy the girl's father 2 crates of beer as punishment. Then feminist groups from Mexico City protested. And the answer was what? Was that, sorry, in this city, indigenous communities are ruled by a system popularly known as usos y costumbres, traditions and customs, supposed to enshrine the traditions of local populations in a state with diverse indigenous groups. So, you see, they wanted to do something noble, not just this bourgeois abstract law. Let's include into our legal system the wisdom, 1,000-year-old wisdom of local communities, and so on and so on. The result is what? The result is that, because this is part of their tradition or whatever, that you rape 8-year-old girl and you are punished by paying, by having to buy 2 crates of beer, and many other examples, and so on and so on. So what I want to say is that we have to be courageous enough to admit that these famous local traditions are not really a site of resistance, something from where we can attack what is wrong with global capitalism. I think that the problem with global capitalism is precisely that it's not, global enough. I don't have time to go in detail here, and so I will just go to my concluding moments, to the title of my talk, finally, Rage, Rebellion, New Power. That's the problem of all this. Ultimately, the problem of populism is for me something that, referring to Noam Chomsky, we can call a crisis in manufacturing consent. Our political system is not just a set of explicit rules, written, unwritten, but it's a lot of customs of how things effectively function, and that no longer works. And populism is one of the ways to fill in this void. What's our problem today? We know that this triad, rage, rebellion, and the new power, is a kind of a basic triad of every revolutionary process. First, there is chaotic rage. People are not satisfied, they show it in a more or less violent way, without any clear goal and organization. Then, when this rage gets articulated, organized, we get a rebellion with a minimal organization and more or less clear awareness of who the enemy is. Finally, if rebellion succeeds, the new power confronts the immense task of organizing the new society. The problem is that we almost never get this triad in its logical progression. Chaotic rage gets diluted or turns into a rightist populism, rebellion succeeds but loses steam, and so on and so on. So, this is why in our societies, more and more, rage is not only the beginning, but also the end, the outcome of failed emancipatory projects. Remember, I always remember them. 10 years ago, how the French suburban riots were exploding, where thousands of cars were burning and there were major outbursts of public violence in suburbs of Paris and so on. What strikes the eye in these protests, what struck the eye was the total absence of any positive utopian prospect. If May 68 was a revolt with a utopian vision, the 2005 revolts were outbursts with no pretense to vision. If the oft-repeated commonplace that we live in a post-ideological era has any sense, it is here. There was no program.
现在又爆发了，没有已经停了，又没了，又停息了。传统异能。
And this tells a lot about our predicament, because as even Axel Honneth noticed in his last book, Idea des Sozialismus, Idea of Socialism, the great paradox of our situation is that there is a growing dissatisfaction with global capitalism, which often explodes in rage, but it is less and less possible to articulate this rage into a new leftist political project. So this is how things disintegrate back into rage. But let's take the example where we had a success. There was a new power, the victory of Syriza in Greece. I think it's a genuine tragedy what happened there. I totally oppose to those idiots who simply shout, betrayal, betrayal. Syriza won a referendum and then were afraid to act upon it. No, I think that when people blame that capitulation, or whatever you call it, of Syriza, the usual counter-argument is that Syriza forgot or obliterated its links to actual social movements. That the moment Syriza took power, already before, it was no longer what was its strength, the network of local movement, feminist, workers' rights, ecological. It simply became another party competing for state power. I think that this exactly is a wrong counter-argument to make. I don't think that keeping links keeping links alive with social base, maintaining roots in actual social movements, this is simply an excuse. The big problem is precisely that the left didn't yet invent a formula of effectively, how should I put it, what to do when you take power, how to reorganize power. We have 2-3 models. We have real socialist, communist, Stalinist model. It didn't work. We see it clearly. We have social democratic model, welfare state. It worked as long as it worked. It didn't work at the end. Today, frankly, no. I mean, the tragedy is, with some exceptions, I admit it, that social democracy is basically today the great conservative power. Their motive is basically, let's not abandon, let's keep our old achievements. We all know that we live in new times where tremendous things are happening. I'm not ideologically blinded by them, but just think about 2-3 of them, about 8 so-called cooperative commons. I don't believe that this is already a new communism, but obviously the market economy is gradually overcoming itself. Or just think philosophically about what the new digitalization of our lives, but digitalization combined with biogenetics and so on, brain sciences, leads to. We will be more and more dominated by digital machines, and I'm not even afraid of it. Look, it can already be proven. I read some wonderful experiments with, they did it in United States. They, in so many levels, for example, even in stock market investing, do you know that you already can download for free a program which is demonstrated through experiments, which will tell you when to buy, to sell your stocks better than the most expensive stockbrokers, advisors, and so on and so on. Machines know it better. Machines already can diagnose you better than at least the average doctor. Some progressive leftists, I like this cynicism, sociologists even proved that computers can do it better in elections. Because we are stupid, confused people. You hate the ruling government, but that usually through some last-minute spins and manipulations. You vote for something immediately before elections out of fear and so on, which goes against your interest. What they, my friends, did it is people, selected people, allowed the computer to follow their everyday experience, all the disappointment with politics, economics, and so on. And then computer, who kept the entire picture, decided how to vote. It was much more to the left even. Even they decided that with marriage, they, again, to two sets of the people whom will you marry, not a computer did better. And but I mean, these are not naive science fiction people. They are not claiming computers cannot make mistakes. No, they are also stupid and so on. They are just saying on average they are doing much better than our daily life. So where are we coming? We have just different fantasies here. One fantasy is so-called singularity. Total idiots, I think so, like Ray Kurzweil and so on, you know. We are all portraying the moment when we will all be combined into one big mega post-human awareness. Or we will simply be reduced to idiots, to puppets manipulated digitally or through biogenetic and so on and so on. But my prediction is that something third will happen, the combination of the two. What do I mean by this? You know, I always remember here one of my favorite Stalinist jokes, that in the mid-30s they were debating in the Politburo, will there be money in communism or not? And the right-wing Bukharin people claimed, of course, it's natural to have money to exchange products, so money is natural. There will have to be money in communism. Left-wingers claimed, no, money means alienated commodity societies, there will not be money in communism. Then, Comrade Stalin, the greatest genius, intervenes and said, no, these are both deviations, left-wing, right-wing deviation. The reality is a dialectical synthesis. there will be and there will not be money in communism. Then they ask Stalin, but how do you mean this, Comrade Stalin? And he says, well, it's simple. Some people will have money, others will not have money, no? And my point is that it's the same with this digitalization, you know. Some people will lose their freedom, other people will not lose their freedom. And I mean, there are such complex things happening today. What will happen again with cooperative commons? With, I think the big problem I see with, we already see the tendencies to post-market economy. It's clear. It's clear. It's clear that the way intellectual property functions today, it more and more undermines private property. And I even see potentially a progressive element in all these ultra-capitalist horrors like Uber, taxes, and so on and so on. Something new is emerging. We don't yet have concrete ideas what to do. You know, to be very brief, short, you know what's the problem for me? Did you see the film, which I don't like very much, but that's why I'm mentioning it to you, V for Vendetta with Natalie Portman and so on? You remember how the film ends? The crowd attacks the British Parliament, victory of the revolution, end of the film. As I usually say, my God, I'm ready to sell my mother into slavery to see a film called V for Vendetta Part 2. But what happens then, next day? How do they organize new power and so on? I don't believe in state socialism, of course not. I don't believe in, no longer in welfare, social democratic capitalism. But I also don't believe, if anything, even less, I believe in the last, I claim, remainder of the 20th century that will have to be sacrificed, immediate council democracy, you know. What is still alive for 20th century is this idea against alienated representational politics, local communities, organizing their life, and so on and so on. I think this is a horrible vision. It's totally wrong politically and so on. First, no, local communities with living self-management, self-organization cannot save us. I literally, I'm not joking, I will again be accused of provocations. I think we need more alienation, precisely alienation in the sense of efficient bureaucracy. If I have a problem today, it's bureaucratic socialism. Now you will say horror, GDR, Stalinism. No, don't you see, if you read, and I do with pleasure always, old Stalinist texts, the biggest problem of Stalinism was bureaucracy. Stalinism couldn't organize a well-functioning bureaucracy. That's why it always needed an emergency state. An ideal social model for me is not some stupid local community where every afternoon I have to go to some debate group, how we will distribute water, how we will... No, I want to live in a nice alienated society where there is an invisible, relatively well-functioning network which provides water, electricity, health, and so on. And I want to be left alone to watch movies, to read and write my books, and so on, and so on. First problem. Second problem, what we need today with the problems we are confronting, intellectual property, ecology, brain sciences, and so on. Immigrants. We need more and more strong, large-scale organizations, I claim. Just think about Fukushima. Do you know my friend Jean-Pierre Dupuy, who was there immediately after? He is a theorist of catastrophes and was sent by European Union. He said that, you know that for a couple of hours, Japanese authorities thought that the radiations will be so strong that they will have to evacuate the entire Tokyo area, 30 million people. Where would they go? How? We need even stronger than state, larger organizations. I mean, local communities are wonderful insofar as they, local self-organized communities, insofar as they work. But I always claim for them to work, quite many things have to function imperceptibly in the background. And that's where the battle is decided. Okay, we debate how to organize health, but for this you have to have large hospitals which work. How to distribute water, electricity, who organizes that, and so on, and so on. So another thing, that's the true, if you ask me, tragedy for me. I will not name you names, but I'm sad that I cannot for ethical reasons. I spoke with many well-known leftists recently, really big names, who all privately, like in secret, literally told me that, you know, the only hope for us today is a big mega catastrophe. Not just 1,000 dead, but at least a couple of hundreds of thousand dead. That such a radical catastrophe is the only thing that can awaken people to make them to take seriously social change and so on and so on. But this makes me even say, where are we when the radical left literally not only awaits mega catastrophe as their only chance, but even some of the leftists told me maybe we should even risk it to organize this catastrophe, to explode a couple of how do you call it, atomic energy, nuclear electric plants, and so on and so on. This is for me just another thing in this hopelessness. We don't have a model. And I think that in spite of all these problems, now I will finish, although the picture is bleak, we have to persist. Namely, if the picture is so dark as I painted it, then you can say, but my God, why don't simply resign to a radical change? Why don't we say, okay, let's play the modest game that goes on. Modest, small changes, maybe it will work. No, I am more of a pessimist. I think that we are today approaching, and although Chomsky really hates me, but a good friend of mine recently visited Chomsky, now, 2 weeks ago, and told me something very sad, that Chomsky in private, drinking coffee after the official interview, told him that he is already active politically for 60 years, and that now, I mean the last month, Chomsky told him he is for the first time really desperate. He really thinks that ecology, possibility of new world war, Russia, Western Europe, and so on, that he thinks we are on the edge of a catastrophe. So the problem is not, should we resign ourselves? The problem is that something will have to be done. I prefer not to think what type of society we are approaching, and we even know it in some sense, I claim. Who is we here? We are a collective ideological subject which is formed by Hollywood, and my God, Hollywood knows it. You remember all these big post-apocalyptic blockbusters that we have now, they all paint the same society which fits very much the image painted by Peter Sloterdijk in his book on the cupola of capitalism. You know, the privileged 20% living under a cupola, protected, the majority is outside. So we are all aware of the need of a radical change. People often attack me. Why are you taking seriously Sloterdijk? He is a neo-Nazi, eugenic, whatever. Maybe, but read his book, I forgot which one of his latest books. He wonderfully, develops this idea. My God, he gets pretty radical. He claims that, wait a minute, read him what he claims. He claims that because of ecological catastrophe and other threats, the idea of sovereign nation state and capitalism is self-destructive. He says this. He says that if there is a lesson from ecology, it's that capitalism has this inbuilt tendency of ignoring as collateral damage these costs which you don't have to pay for to the environment and so on and so on. And quite correctly, he joins hands here, Sloterdijk of all people, with David Harvey and so on, who says that we cannot solve this problem as some left Keynesians dream, or feminist Keynesians, so that we include into the price of the commodity also all these collateral costs. I mean, I read some of their books, they're wonderful utopian reading. The idea is that they try to calculate, I don't know how many trillions of dollars, the cost of entire water supply of Earth. And then if you use water, it should be added to the price of a commodity. Or the idea is women's homework, non-paid, taking care of children, if they still do it and so on, they should also be given a salary for that. But I think this is precisely a model of utopia, of how you want to over-expand a model. No, the problem is to get out of capitalist logic. It's the only way, that, of course, where do I absolutely not agree with Sloterdijk is that he just correctly concludes that, first, this state sovereignty logic, where the greatest heroic act is war, sacrifice yourself for your country and so on, and this capitalist logic of neglecting consequences and so on, that it's a matter of our survival to step out of this. Then, being Sloterdijk, he, of course, doesn't give any realistic or even minimally concrete plans, ideas even of how to do this, who will do it, how it will be done, and so on and so on. But I claim that I don't claim anything, basically. I don't have a clear idea here. But I absolutely claim that we are approaching a potential catastrophe. And maybe we are getting caught into some kind of a weird moral inertia. Look, you remember 30 years ago, 40 years ago, even more, Vietnam War. There was still, even for Iraq War, big demonstrations and so on. But today, much worse things are happening. Look at the ultra-tragedy of Aleppo today in Syria. Even out of egotist reasons, out of the meanest egotist reasons, we should be more mobilized. My God, we can see there hundreds of thousands of you new refugees in the making. No, we are just apathetic. Or look at all this Putin, Western Europe, United States madness. Are we aware that we are already entering the climate of the next world war? Our situation is not, as people claim, now we have new fascism, it's like Western Europe in the 1930s. No, I think a much better metaphor is the years before the Great War, before the First World War, where everyone was talking about the war, and then the big surprise was that the war really exploded. Why? Because everyone was talking about it, but nobody took it seriously. You know, I think, isn't this our deepest attitude towards, if you ask me, of the majority of us, attitude towards ecological threat? We are well aware there are dangers, but deeply existentially we cannot even imagine that, you know, that our daily, like you go out, my God, look, you know, now it's not, okay, but when it's spring, it's sun, birds are singing, what can change, and so on. It can. I think our situation today, again, is the situation before First World War. And from what I read in the media, are we aware what is going on? United States putting their battalions on the border of Russia. Russia already organized, my friends from Russia send me messages which are terrifying. They told me they already organized in the big cities exercises for nuclear attack and so on and so on. And again, this is the tragedy. The fact that you are not taking it seriously is, for me, precisely the fact that makes it realistic that it will happen. And if you ask me what's my solution, the only thing I will tell you is that I'm a pessimist. But maybe pessimists are the only happy people, you know, in a very stupid common sense. If you are a pessimist, then you are, since things are usually not so absolutely bad, then you are all the time in small details happily surprised, you know. For me, a pessimist is the only way to be a little bit glad. You see, nonetheless, this happened, that happened. That's the problem. I see today the situation as potentially revolutionary in the very traditional Marxist sense. Forces of production are developing in a way which makes them incompatible with our economic social order and so on. And if we don't do something, we will live in, you know, where from the movies, like Elysium, like Hunger Games, and so on and so on. And I think that here, again, I don't have time to develop it, I did it in my books, but I don't think the language we should speak is this language of open situation, or we can make a choice and so on and so on. No, it's a closed, I'm a fatalist. Namely, I think that we have to accept that we are lost. That there will be a war, but maybe we can postpone it, we can, you know, and that sometimes the only way to avoid the catastrophe is to accept it as unavoidable. Like my good friend Frank Ruda recently published a book in English, I think only in German, a defense of fatalism. And I'm ready to follow it, namely, in what sense? People like to say how the past is determined, the past is what it was, while the future is open. We have a choice. I claim more and more that exactly the opposite is true. The future is closed. It's our fate. We are caught in dynamic, while the past is open. As we learned from Benjamin, from I don't know who, we can change it. Of course, not in reality, but the point is not to say how we can act differently, but to change the past itself. We should take the lesson of Protestantism, of predestination, which is for me, as already my good friend Frederick Jameson emphasized, the most interesting notion for a Marxist from theology is the Protestant notion of predestination. Because it's the exact opposite of radical fatalism. Now we'll say predestination means everything is determined. Yes, everything is determined, but you don't know in what way, in what sense is determined. What is freedom, actual freedom? Imagine you are in a situation where you have to choose strawberry cake or cheesecake. That's freedom in a stupid sense, totally non-interesting. Remember yourself in a situation where somebody tells you it's predestined what you will do. You don't have a choice. But you don't know what is predestined. And then you sweat, you are afraid that you will not miss your destiny. And in this absolute anxiety, not to miss the inevitable, you get close to true freedom. We must do something like that. Okay, I've spoken too much. I'm grateful for your patience. Thank you very much.
我没说话，我去看一下他们踢球有没有回来。他们回来了，我要去让他们复盘一下这个 复盘一下这两天活动的情况。我先下播啦，我已经下了，明儿见吧。拜拜，明天见，拜拜。